What they didn't know was that beneath the dented gas tank and faded paint lay secrets that would turn their world upside down. This is the story of how a seemingly worthless inheritance became the key to uncovering a hero's legacy and teaching some bullies the most expensive lesson of their lives. The desert sun blazed mercilessly over Phoenix, Arizona, as 23-year-old Jake Martinez stood before what appeared to be a monument to motorcycle neglect. The 1978 Harley-Davidson Sportster sat abandoned in the far corner of Veterans Auto Repair. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Its once proud chrome, now surrendering to rust. Its black leather seat cracked like dried earth after a drought. To any casual observer, it was scrap, metal on two wheels, a relic that had seen better decades. But Jake saw something different entirely. As his calloused fingers traced the worn rubber grips on the handlebars, he could almost feel the ghost of his grandfather's hands, weathered by years of military service and honest mechanical work. This wasn't just a motorcycle. It was the last tangible piece of Staff Sergeant Roberto "Bobby" Martinez, a man who had survived 3 tours in the jungles of Vietnam, only to lose his final battle against Alzheimer's disease 6 months ago. The old Sportster looked like it had been through a war zone, which, as Jake would soon discover, it literally had. Every dent, every scratch, every patch of faded paint told a story that his grandfather had taken to his grave. The bike hadn't run in over a decade, hadn't been properly maintained in even longer, and according to every mechanic who'd seen it, wasn't worth the cost of restoration. Jake remembered the day at the lawyer's office when he'd received the inheritance. Attorney Patricia Williams had been apologetic, almost embarrassed, as she slid the keys across the mahogany desk. "I'm sorry, it's not much, son. Your grandfather was very specific that you should get the motorcycle, but between you and me, it might cost more to fix than it's worth. Maybe you could sell it for parts?" The suggestion had stung, not because of the money — Jake was used to being broke — but because it felt like betraying the man who'd raised him. After his parents died in that car accident when he was 8, Grandpa Bobby had been everything: father figure, teacher, best friend, and the steady hand that guided him through the chaos of grief and growing up. Now, as a struggling engineering student working double shifts at a campus coffee shop and weekend construction gigs, Jake barely had enough money for textbooks, let alone motorcycle restoration. His cramped studio apartment near Arizona State University was a far cry from his grandfather's spacious garage, where he'd spent countless hours learning the difference between a wrench and a ratchet, between engines that purred and engines that growled. But this wasn't about money. It never had been. Standing in the sweltering garage, Jake noticed details that had escaped him during his previous visits. Hidden beneath layers of desert dust and mechanical grime, small traces of his grandfather's military past began to emerge. There, on the rear fender, was a barely visible decal, a faded eagle with outstretched wings clutching a banner that read, "Death from Above," the 82nd Airborne Division's motto. Another sticker, so weathered it was almost invisible, showed the outline of a paratrooper's wings. His grandfather had been a legend in the 82nd Airborne, though you'd never know it from talking to him. Like so many veterans of his generation, Bobby Martinez had locked his war stories away in some deep compartment of his mind, sharing only fragments with his grandson. Jake knew about the 3 Purple Hearts stored in a shoebox in the closet, about the Bronze Star with V device for valor that his grandfather claimed wasn't that big a deal, and about the nightmares that occasionally brought the old man bolt upright at 3 a.m., sweating and calling out names of men who'd never made it home. What Jake didn't know was that his grandfather's war had never really ended. The old soldier had simply changed battlefields, trading jungle warfare for the quieter but no less significant battles of raising a traumatized grandson, building a small business, and carrying the weight of survivor's guilt for 45 years. The motorcycle had been Bobby's therapy, his meditation, his way of staying connected to the speed and danger that had once defined his existence. Every Sunday morning, without fail, he'd fire up the Sportster and disappear into the Arizona desert for hours, returning with stories about hidden canyons and forgotten ghost towns. Those rides had stopped when the Alzheimer's began stealing his memories, when the man who could once navigate through hostile territory using only the stars became confused by familiar neighborhood streets. As Jake ran his hands over the bike's dented tank, he felt something his grandfather had tried to teach him: that true value wasn't always visible on the surface. Bobby Martinez had been a master at seeing potential where others saw problems, at finding diamonds in the rough, at recognizing that sometimes the most broken things were worth the most effort to repair. The afternoon heat was becoming unbearable, but Jake couldn't bring himself to leave. Something about this moment felt significant, like standing at the edge of a cliff before deciding whether to jump. He had no idea that his grandfather's past was about to collide violently with his present, that the bike's hidden secrets would soon make him the target of the most dangerous motorcycle club in the Southwest. Most importantly, he had no clue that within hours, he would discover that heroism, like an old Harley-Davidson, could be passed down from one generation to the next, often hidden beneath layers of rust and time, waiting for the right moment to roar back to life. Jake Martinez looked nothing like what Hollywood would cast as an action hero. At 5'8", with a lean build carved by construction work rather than gym sessions, he possessed the kind of understated strength that came from necessity, not vanity. His dark hair was perpetually messy from wearing hard hats and baseball caps, and his clothes, faded jeans, work boots, and a sun-bleached ASU engineering t-shirt, marked him as just another struggling college student trying to make ends meet in an expensive world. But there was something in Jake's dark brown eyes that hinted at depths beyond his 23 years. Perhaps it was the way he carried himself with quiet confidence, or how his hands moved with surprising precision when he worked. Those hands had learned their skills in his grandfather's garage, where Bobby Martinez had passed down more than just mechanical knowledge. He'd taught patience, attention to detail, and the understanding that sometimes the most important work happened beneath the surface, invisible to casual observers. This Saturday morning found Jake exactly where he'd been every weekend for the past month, staring at his inheritance and wondering where to begin. The storage fee at Veterans Auto Repair was eating into his already tight budget. $30 a week, that meant choosing between textbooks and groceries. But he couldn't bring himself to abandon the bike or sell it for scrap like everyone suggested. His phone buzzed with a text from his roommate, David. "Dude, you coming to the party tonight? Sarah's friend is asking about you." Jake smiled despite himself. David had been trying to set him up for months, convinced that Jake's dedication to work and study was unhealthy for a college student. But Jake had responsibilities that most of his classmates couldn't understand: rent, utilities, car payments, and the constant pressure of maintaining his GPA to keep his partial scholarship. The truth was, Jake didn't have time for parties or dating. His typical day started at 5 a.m. with an opening shift at Mountain Grounds Coffee, the campus shop where he served overpriced lattes to students whose weekly allowances exceeded his monthly income. After classes, he'd rush to whatever construction site needed extra hands, spending afternoons in the punishing Arizona heat laying foundation, hanging drywall, or any other job that paid cash and didn't ask too many questions about his lack of experience. His grandfather would have been proud of his work ethic, but worried about the price Jake was paying. Bobby Martinez had always preached balance: work hard, but don't forget to live. "Life's not just about surviving, mijo," he'd say while teaching Jake to adjust a carburetor. "It's about finding something worth the struggle." Jake's something worth the struggle was his engineering degree, specifically aerospace engineering. It was an ambitious goal for a kid who'd grown up in his grandfather's garage, but Bobby had encouraged every dream, no matter how big. "Smart. Hands and a smart head," the old man would say, watching Jake troubleshoot engine problems with methodical precision. That combination can take you anywhere. Now, standing in the stifling garage, Jake pulled out his phone and opened the voice memo app, a habit he'd developed during his grandfather's final months when Alzheimer's was stealing memories faster than they could be recorded. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He'd captured hundreds of hours of Bobby's stories, technical knowledge, and random observations, creating a digital library of wisdom that he played back during lonely nights in his studio apartment. Day 32 with the Sportster, Jake said into the phone, his voice echoing in the empty garage. Still looks like something that crawled out of a junkyard, but I'm starting to see what Grandpa meant about looking deeper. There are details here that don't match the bike's apparent condition, custom modifications that someone with serious mechanical knowledge made. The question is, why would someone put expensive upgrades into a bike they were planning to abandon? Jake's engineering mind had been cataloging inconsistencies since his first visit. The suspension components were higher quality than the bike's original specifications suggested. The frame showed signs of reinforcement work that went beyond standard repair. Most intriguingly, the rear storage compartment had been modified, with what appeared to be a hidden panel, something he'd only noticed because his grandfather had taught him to look for things that didn't belong. As he knelt beside the bike, Jake's phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Elena Vasquez, his grandfather's former doctor, and one of the few people who truly understood what Bobby Martinez had meant to the community. Dr. Vasquez had been treating veterans for 30 years and had developed a special fondness for the quiet mechanic who never complained about his own pain but worried constantly about other people's motorcycles. "Jake? I hope I'm not interrupting." Her warm voice carried through the phone. "I wanted to check how you're doing with Bobby's bike. I know he had some specific instructions about it." Jake felt his heart skip. "Instructions? What kind of instructions?" "He made me promise not to say anything until you'd had the bike for at least a month. Bobby was very particular about timing. Said you'd need to discover some things on your own before you were ready to hear the rest. Are you somewhere private where we can talk?" Jake looked around the empty garage, suddenly aware that his ordinary Saturday was about to become something entirely different. He had no idea that Dr. Vasquez's call would set in motion events that would transform him from a struggling college student into the unwitting guardian of secrets that powerful people would kill to possess. "I'm alone," Jake said, settling onto a workbench as sweat dripped down his back in the oppressive heat. "What did Grandpa want you to tell me?" Dr. Vasquez's voice softened with the kind of warmth that only came from years of helping veterans navigate their deepest struggles. "Your grandfather left very specific instructions, Jake. He said when you called asking about the bike's hidden compartment, I should tell you about the night he brought it to my clinic, bleeding and barely conscious, 37 years ago." Jake's hands went cold despite the sweltering heat. "What are you talking about? Grandpa never mentioned any accident." "It wasn't an accident, mijo. It was 1987, and your grandfather had just returned from what he called one last mission, something that wasn't supposed to exist on any official records. He'd been recruited for a covert operation to recover stolen military assets from a cartel that had been targeting American servicemen. The mission went sideways, and Bobby barely escaped with his life, and with something the cartel desperately wanted back." Jake sank onto the workbench, his mind reeling. The grandfather he remembered was a quiet mechanic who fixed bikes and made the world's best breakfast burritos, not some kind of secret operative. "Dr. Vasquez, are you sure we're talking about the same person? My grandfather never talked about it, I know. Bobby made me promise to keep his secrets until after he was gone, until you were old enough to handle the truth. That night in 1987, he stumbled into my clinic with 3 bullet wounds and a story that would have sounded impossible if I hadn't seen the evidence with my own eyes." Jake's throat felt dry as desert sand. "What evidence?" "The contents of that hidden compartment in his bike, Jake. Your grandfather didn't just survive that mission. He completed it. He recovered something that certain people have been searching for ever since, something worth killing for. The garage suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in as Jake tried to process what he was hearing. His grandfather, the man who'd taught him to tie his shoes and helped with algebra homework, had been living with deadly secrets for decades. What did he recover? Dr. Vasquez paused, and Jake could hear the weight of 37 years of secret-keeping in her silence. Documentation. Jake. Evidence of corruption that goes all the way to the top of several major organizations. Names, dates, financial records, photographs. Enough to destroy some very powerful people. The cartel wasn't just stealing military equipment, they were being protected by officials on both sides of the border who were taking cuts of the profits. Jake's engineering mind struggled to compute this information. But why keep it? Why not turn it over to the authorities? Because some of the names on those documents were the authorities, mijo. Bobby didn't know who he could trust, so he decided to become the guardian of that information. He figured as long as he stayed quiet and lived a normal life, everyone would assume the evidence died with the other members of his team. The mention of other team members sent a chill down Jake's spine. What happened to his team? They didn't make it out. Bobby was the sole survivor, which made him both the only witness and the only target. For 37 years, he's been looking, over his shoulder, waiting for someone to come asking questions about that night. Jake thought about all those times he'd caught his grandfather staring out the window with a distant look, all those nights when nightmares had jolted the old man awake. He'd always assumed it was just war trauma, the kind that haunted so many veterans. Now he realized his grandfather had been carrying a much more immediate and dangerous burden. The Alzheimer's, Jake said quietly, understanding dawning. He knew he was losing his memory. That's why he was so insistent about the timing, about waiting a month before I told you anything. Bobby wanted to make sure you'd spent time with the bike, that you'd developed a connection to it before you learned what it really represents. He also wanted to see if anyone would come looking for it after his death. Jake's blood ran cold. Has anyone come looking? Not yet, but Bobby was convinced they eventually would. That's why he chose you, Jake. He said you have the intelligence to understand the significance of what he's hidden, the integrity to use it responsibly, and the courage to do what's right when the time comes. Standing in the oppressive heat of the garage, Jake felt the weight of his grandfather's legacy settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. This wasn't just about inheriting a motorcycle anymore. It was about becoming the keeper of secrets that had already cost men their lives. Dr. Vasquez, what exactly am I supposed to do with this information? For now, nothing. Bobby's instructions were very clear. Live your life, pursue your dreams, but be prepared. He believed that someday someone would force your hand, and when that day came, you'd need to make the same choice he made 37 years ago, stay silent and live with the weight of truth, or risk everything to make sure justice is served. Jake looked at the bike with new eyes, seeing not just his grandfather's beloved Harley, but a time bomb that had been ticking for nearly 4 decades. Hidden somewhere in that rusted, seemingly worthless machine was evidence that could topple governments and destroy criminal empires. There's something else, Dr. Vasquez continued. Bobby left a letter for you. It's in my safe, and he wanted you to have it only after you'd heard the full story. In it, he explains exactly how to access the hidden compartment and what you'll find inside. But Jake, once you read that letter and open that compartment, there's no going back. You'll know things that dangerous people have killed to protect. Jake wiped sweat from his forehead, his mind racing with implications he wasn't ready to face. His biggest worry an hour ago had been paying next month's rent. Now he was being asked to decide whether to become the guardian of secrets that could change everything. Can I have some time to think about this? Of course, mijo. But remember, your grandfather chose you for a reason. He saw something in you that reminded him of the soldier he used to be, the man who couldn't walk away when justice needed a champion. As Jake hung up the phone, he realized his ordinary Saturday had just become the day his life split into before and after. In a few hours, he would learn that his grandfather's past was about to become his present in the most dangerous way possible. The following Tuesday evening found Jake at Rusty's Roadhouse, a biker bar on the outskirts of Phoenix, where chrome gleamed under neon beer signs and the air thick with cigarette smoke and motor oil. He hadn't planned to come here, hadn't planned to do anything except go to classes and pretend his world hadn't been turned upside down by Dr. Vasquez's revelations. But something had drawn him to this place, some inexplicable need to be around motorcycles and the people who understood their language. Rusty's was the kind of establishment that looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a biker movie. Weathered wooden tables scarred by decades of beer bottles and cigarette burns, walls covered with vintage motorcycle memorabilia, and faded photographs of riders who'd earned their place in local legend. The jukebox in the corner played a steady rotation of classic rock, while the smell of grilled burgers and spilled beer created an atmosphere that was somehow both welcoming and intimidating. Jake nursed a Coke at the bar, feeling conspicuously out of place in his clean clothes and obvious inexperience with this world. The other patrons were exactly what you'd expect: leather-clad riders with gray beards and stories etched in the lines around their eyes, younger enthusiasts eager to prove their worth, and the occasional curious tourist who'd wandered in looking for authentic atmosphere. The bartender, a weathered woman in her 50s with intricate tattoos covering both arms, had introduced herself as Diane and taken pity on Jake's obvious discomfort. "First time at Rusty's?" she asked, wiping down glasses with practiced efficiency. "Yeah. I inherited my grandfather's bike, trying to figure out what to do with it." Diane's expression softened immediately. "Ah, one of those situations. What kind of bike?" 1978. Sportster. Needs a lot of work. Those old Sportsters are good bikes when they're running right. Your grandfather ride with any of the local clubs?" Jake shrugged, suddenly realizing how little he actually knew about his grandfather's connections in the motorcycle community. "I don't think so. He was pretty much a loner, worked on bikes more than he rode them in his later years." What Jake didn't know was that his presence at Rusty's had already been noted by several sets of eyes, including those of Marco Tank Rodriguez, vice president of the Desert Serpents MC, one of the most feared motorcycle clubs in the Southwest. Tank had been nursing his whiskey in a corner booth for the past hour, but his attention had sharpened the moment he heard Jake mention a 1978 Sportster and a grandfather who worked on bikes. Tank was a mountain of a man, 6'4" and built, like the nickname suggested, with arms covered in tattoos that told the story of 20 years in various motorcycle clubs. His presence commanded respect in places like Rusty's, where reputation was everything and weakness was spotted and exploited within minutes. But tonight, Tank's interest wasn't in intimidation. It was in information. For the past 6 months, the Desert Serpents had been following leads about a certain motorcycle that had disappeared after a job went bad in 1987. Their employer, a man who preferred to remain in the shadows but paid very well for results, had been quite specific about what he was looking for: a 1978 Harley-Davidson Sportster with custom modifications, last seen in the possession of a former soldier named Roberto Martinez. Tank's phone buzzed with a text from his prospect Danny, who was stationed outside. "Kid just walked out, getting into a beat-up Honda Civic. Plates are ASU student parking." The pieces were falling into place with almost disappointing ease. Tank had expected this to be more difficult, but sometimes the universe handed you exactly what you needed. He finished his whiskey and stood, his movement causing several conversations to pause as other patrons instinctively assessed whether trouble was brewing. But Tank wasn't interested in causing a scene at Rusty's. This was a place where the motorcycle community came to relax, and there were unwritten rules about respecting that sanctuary. Besides, he had all the information he needed for now. The kid had confirmed the bike existed, confirmed the connection to Roberto Martinez, and most importantly, had no idea what he was walking into. Outside in the parking lot, Jake climbed into his Honda Civic, completely unaware that his evening at Rusty's had just painted a target on his back. The desert air was cooling as the sun set behind the mountains, and the city lights were beginning to twinkle in the distance. Phoenix at night had always felt magical to Jake, a sprawling oasis of humanity surrounded by endless wilderness, a place where people came to reinvent themselves or disappear entirely. As he drove home through neighborhoods that ranged from million-dollar mansions to mobile home parks, Jake's mind wandered back to Dr. Vasquez's words about his grandfather's secret mission. The idea still seemed surreal, like something from a movie rather than his quiet family history. How had Bobby Martinez managed to live a normal life for 37 years while carrying such dangerous secrets? The answer, Jake was beginning to realize, was that his grandfather had been far more careful and strategic than anyone had given him credit for. Bobby hadn't just hidden evidence, he'd hidden himself in plain sight, becoming the unremarkable neighborhood mechanic who attracted no attention and asked no questions. But now that careful camouflage was beginning to unravel. Jake's innocent evening at Rusty's had been the first crack in a facade that had protected his family for decades. Soon, he would learn that in the world his grandfather had tried to shield him from, even the smallest mistakes could have deadly consequences. Tank Rodriguez sat in his truck outside the roadhouse, watching Jake's taillights disappear into traffic. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized but never saved in his contacts. "We found him," Tank said when the call connected. "The Martinez kid. He's got the bike, just like you thought he would." The voice on the other end was cold, professional, and completely without mercy. "Good. It's time to collect what's ours. But remember, we need him alive until we're sure he's accessed the compartment. After that..." The line went dead. Tank stared at his phone for a moment, then started his engine. Tomorrow, Jake Martinez's ordinary college life would end forever. The next morning, Jake arrived at Dr. Vasquez's clinic with a mixture of determination and dread churning in his stomach. He'd spent the entire night thinking about his grandfather's letter, about secrets hidden in rusted metal, and about the weight of decisions that could change everything. But it wasn't until he walked into the small waiting room that his unconscious training began to show. Without realizing it, Jake positioned himself with his back to the wall, facing the entrance, a habit his grandfather had drilled into him. During their camping trips, always disguised as practical advice about keeping an eye on your surroundings. His eyes automatically cataloged the exit routes, the potential weapons, a heavy glass ashtray, a metal magazine rack, and the sightlines from the windows. To any casual observer, he looked like a nervous college student. But Dr. Vasquez, who had spent 30 years treating veterans, recognized something deeper. "You're more like him than you know," she said softly, emerging from her office with a manila envelope that looked like it had been waiting decades to be opened. Jake's hands were surprisingly steady as he accepted the letter, despite the magnitude of what it represented. Another unconscious habit from his grandfather's teaching: steady hands save lives, mijo. Whether you're fixing an engine or facing a crisis, panic is the enemy of precision. Dr. Vasquez led him to her private office, where the afternoon light filtered through blinds that she adjusted with the automatic precision of someone who understood the importance of controlling visibility from outside. "Your grandfather wrote this 3 years ago, when the Alzheimer's diagnosis first came in. He wanted to make sure his instructions were clear while his mind was still sharp. The letter was written in Bobby's careful handwriting, the same script that had filled the margins of Jake's childhood homework with encouraging notes and mechanical tips. Mijo, if you're reading this, then Elena has told you about 1987 and why I've carried these secrets for so long. By now, you're probably scared, maybe angry that I kept this from you. Good. Fear and anger will keep you alive when people come looking for what I've hidden. You need to understand something important. Everything I taught you in the garage wasn't just about fixing motorcycles. Every lesson about patience, precision, and reading situations was preparation for this moment. Remember how I always made you check your tools twice before starting any job? How I taught you to listen to what engines were really telling you? Those weren't just mechanical skills, Jake. They were survival skills. The hidden compartment is behind the rear storage panel, but opening it requires a specific sequence. Not because I wanted to make it difficult, but because the wrong approach will destroy what's inside. You'll need to use the techniques I taught you about problem solving under pressure. Think like an engineer, not like someone desperate for answers. Most importantly, trust your instincts. I spent years teaching you to read people and situations, and those lessons will serve you now more than ever. When dangerous people come, and they will come, remember that the greatest weapon isn't violence, it's intelligence combined with preparation. You are stronger and more capable than you know, mijo. I made sure of that. Jake read the letter twice, his grandfather's voice echoing in his memory with each word. Slowly, details from his childhood began taking on new significance. Those camping trips where Bobby had insisted on teaching him to move silently through the forest disguised as games of Indian tracking. The way his grandfather had always positioned himself to see all entrances when they ate at restaurants. The seemingly casual lessons about reading body language and detecting when people were lying. He was training me, Jake said quietly, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. Dr. Vasquez nodded. Bobby knew that someday you might need those skills. He also knew that the best training doesn't feel like training. It feels like love, like a grandfather sharing his interests with his grandson. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from his construction supervisor. Need you at the Tempe site today. Electrical contractor didn't show. Jake's mind automatically began calculating the implications. Which bus route would get him there fastest, which tools he'd need, how to manage the work around his class schedule. The same systematic thinking his grandfather had spent years developing. There's something else, Dr. Vasquez said, watching Jake's face carefully. Your grandfather left specific instructions about what to do if anyone started asking questions about the bike before you were ready. He said if that happened, you should trust the training he gave you and remember that sometimes the best defense is looking like you don't know anything important. Jake felt a chill despite the warm office. Has someone been asking questions? Not directly. But yesterday, after our phone call, I had a feeling someone was watching the clinic. It might be nothing, but Bobby always said paranoia was just pattern recognition that made people uncomfortable. As they talked, Jake's engineering mind was already working through the implications of his grandfather's letter. The hidden compartment would require the same methodical approach Bobby had taught him for solving any complex problem. Gather information, analyze the variables, test theories carefully, and never force a solution that wasn't ready to emerge naturally. But more than that, Jake was beginning to understand that his grandfather had been preparing him for a life that was about to become very different from the quiet existence he'd planned. Every skill Bobby had taught him, mechanical precision, situational awareness, the ability to stay calm under pressure, had been deliberate preparation for this moment. Dr. Vasquez, Jake said, standing and folding the letter carefully. My grandfather mentioned that dangerous people would come. How will I know when that happens? She smiled sadly. Trust me, mijo. When they come, you'll know. And when that moment arrives, remember everything Bobby taught you about staying calm and thinking clearly. He believed those skills would be enough to keep you safe and help you make the right choices. As Jake left the clinic, he was unaware that his every movement was being observed through high-powered binoculars from a van parked 3 blocks away. Tank Rodriguez had been watching the clinic since dawn, and now he had confirmation that the Martinez kid was actively pursuing his grandfather's secrets. Time to accelerate the timeline, Tank muttered into his phone. The kid's getting close to accessing whatever the old man hid. We need to make contact before he finds it. Jake walked to his car with the unconscious alertness his grandfather had spent years developing. checking his mirrors, varying his route slightly, and trusting the instincts that whispered something wasn't quite right about the day. He had no idea that his training was about to be tested in ways Bobby Martinez had hoped would never be necessary. By Thursday afternoon, Jake could no longer ignore the feeling that someone was watching him. It started as a whisper of unease during his morning coffee shift at Mountain Grounds, a black SUV that seemed to appear in too many places throughout his day. Then there was the construction worker at the Tempe site who asked too many casual questions about his family and weekend plans. Small things that individually meant nothing, but together formed a pattern that his grandfather's training had taught him to recognize. The realization hit him fully as he sat in his Introduction to Aerospace Engineering class, Professor Chen droning on about thrust-to-weight ratios, while Jake's mind cataloged the inconsistencies in his week. The same motorcycles parked near campus on different days. Phone calls that disconnected immediately when he answered. The feeling of being observed that made his skin crawl during what should have been routine activities. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. When the jungle gets too quiet, that's when you know the tigers are watching. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Nice bike at Veterans Auto Repair. Your grandfather had good taste. Would love to chat about vintage Harleys sometime. A friend. The blood in Jake's veins turned to ice water. Nobody knew about the bike except Dr. Vasquez, the repair shop owner, and himself. He'd been careful not to mention it to classmates or post anything on social media, which meant whoever sent this message had been watching him specifically, following his movements, learning his routines. Professor Chen's voice faded into background noise as Jake's mind shifted into the analytical mode his grandfather had drilled into him. Threat assessment, information gathering, pattern recognition. The lessons disguised as childhood games suddenly felt like survival skills, which Jake was beginning to realize they had always been. He carefully typed back, "Sorry, don't know what you're talking about. Wrong number, maybe?" The response came immediately. Bobby Martinez was your grandfather. 1978, Sportster, rusted tank, cracked seat, ring any bells? Jake's hands remained steady as he typed, another skill Bobby had insisted on developing, but his heart rate spiked. These people knew too much, had been watching too carefully. The casual mention of specific details about the bike's condition suggested they'd either been inside Veterans Auto Repair or had very good surveillance equipment. Who is this? Someone who knew your grandfather back in the day. We should meet. There are things about Bobby's past that you need to understand. Jake closed his phone without responding and scanned the lecture hall with new eyes. Were any of these students watching him? Was the professor part of whatever web his grandfather had spent decades avoiding? The paranoia felt alien and necessary at the same time, like putting on armor that fit perfectly despite never wearing it before. After class, Jake took a deliberately circuitous route to his car, using reflective surfaces and changes in direction to check for surveillance, techniques his grandfather had taught him during games of following animal tracks through the desert. The black SUV was there, maintaining distance, but clearly tracking his movements. 2 motorcycles flanked it at different intervals, their riders wearing dark helmets that concealed their faces. His grandfather's letter had been clear. When dangerous people came, Jake should trust his training and avoid looking like he knew anything important. But the training Bobby had given him also included something else: how to disappear when necessary, how to use urban terrain to break surveillance, how to become invisible in plain sight. Jake led his watchers on a seemingly random tour of Phoenix, stopping at a grocery store where he bought nothing, visiting a library where he checked out a book on motorcycle repair, and finally parking at a busy shopping center where dozens of college students made individual surveillance difficult. Each stop was designed to look normal while testing his followers' capabilities and commitment. They were good, professional good. The vehicles rotated positions, the motorcycles disappeared and reappeared with different riders, and the surveillance, was coordinated in a way that suggested military or law enforcement training. But they were also following someone they assumed was an amateur, which gave Jake advantages they didn't expect him to have. His phone rang as he sat in the shopping center parking lot, pretending to study while actually watching his watchers. Dr. Vasquez's name appeared on the screen. "Jake, where are you right now?" "Papago Plaza." "Why?" "Because 3 men just left my clinic after asking very pointed questions about Bobby's grandson and any conversations we might have had recently. They weren't police, and they weren't friendly. I think your grandfather's timeline has accelerated." Jake felt the familiar calm that settled over him in crisis situations, another gift from Bobby's training. "What did you tell them?" "That patient? Confidentiality prevented me from discussing anything, and that they'd need a warrant if they wanted information. But Jake, these weren't the kind of men who care about warrants. They know you've been to see me, and they know you have your grandfather's letter." Through his peripheral vision, Jake watched one of the motorcycles park near the food court entrance. The rider was speaking into a phone, coordinating with someone. The hunter-prey dynamic was shifting, and Jake realized with crystalline clarity that his ordinary college life had just ended permanently. "Dr. Vasquez, I need you to destroy anything my grandfather left with you. Papers, recordings, anything that connects back to 1987. "Already done, mijo." Bobby's instructions were very clear about what to do if they came asking questions. "But, Jake, you need to understand, these people aren't going to stop. Whatever your grandfather hid, they've been looking for it for 37 years. They're not going to walk away now that they're this close." Jake started his car, his mind all ready, calculating routes that would test his followers' capabilities while leading them away from populated areas. His grandfather's training had covered urban evasion, but it had also emphasized that sometimes the best defense was making sure innocent people weren't caught in the crossfire. "Dr. Vasquez, if anyone asks, you never saw me after that first visit. And whatever happens next, remember that my grandfather spent almost 4 decades keeping these secrets safe. I won't let his sacrifice be for nothing." As Jake pulled out of the parking lot, the black SUV and both motorcycles fell into formation behind him. The game of cat and mouse was over. Now came the part his grandfather had spent years preparing him for. The part where Jake would discover exactly what he was capable of when everything he valued was at stake. Jake led his pursuers through increasingly isolated areas of Phoenix, testing their commitment while moving the confrontation away from civilians. His route took them through industrial districts where warehouses cast long shadows in the late afternoon sun, past abandoned construction sites where the economic downturn had left skeletal buildings reaching toward empty sky. Each turn was calculated, each destination chosen for its tactical advantages. Open sight lines, multiple exit routes, and most importantly, no innocent bystanders. The black SUV maintained its distance with professional patience, while the motorcycles alternated positions like wolves circling prey. Jake's grandfather had taught him that predators revealed their true nature when they sensed cornered quarry, and these hunters were beginning to show their teeth. Finally, at an abandoned truck stop on the outskirts of the city where cracked asphalt stretched between rusted fuel pumps, Jake decided to end the chase. He pulled into the center of the lot and turned off his engine, his hands steady despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Through his rearview mirror, he watched the coordination of his pursuers with the calm, analytical mind Bobby Martinez had spent years developing. The black Escalade entered the lot first, positioning itself to block the main exit. 2 Harley-Davidson touring bikes followed, their riders moving with the fluid precision of men who'd done this many times before. The motorcycles spread out to cover the secondary exits, creating a triangle of intimidation that would have terrified most college students. But Jake wasn't most college students. As the engines shut off and his hunters dismounted their vehicles, he found himself cataloging details with the methodical precision his grandfather had drilled into him. 3 men total, the SUV driver and 2 bikers, all wearing leather, all carrying themselves with the confident swagger of people accustomed to getting their way through force. The man who emerged from the SUV was clearly the leader. Tank Rodriguez was everything Jake had expected from his grandfather's stories about dangerous men. 6'4", built like a linebacker, with the kind of presence that made smart people cross streets to avoid confrontation. His leather vest displayed patches that told a story of violence and authority. Desert Serpents MC, Vice President, and several smaller badges that Jake's grandfather had taught him to recognize as markers of serious criminal involvement. The two bikers flanking. Tank were younger but no less intimidating. One was lean and wiry with prison tattoos covering his arms and the predatory eyes of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain. The other was built more like Tank, massive shoulders and hands that looked capable of crushing bones without effort. Both carried themselves with the casual violence of men who'd made careers out of intimidation. Jake stepped out of his Honda Civic, noting how ridiculous his economy car looked surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of chrome and steel. But his grandfather's training had covered this too. Sometimes looking harmless was the greatest advantage you could have. "Jake Martinez," Tank called out, his voice carrying across the empty lot with the authority of someone accustomed to being. Obeyed. "Thanks for making this easy. We've been looking forward to meeting Bobby's grandson." Jake kept his expression neutral, his body language relaxed but alert. "I'm guessing you're not here to share fond memories of my grandfather." Tank laughed, a sound without humor that echoed off the abandoned buildings. "Oh, we've got plenty of memories about your grandfather, some of them even fond. Bobby was a hell of a soldier back in the day, before he decided to steal something that didn't belong to him." The accusation hung in the desert air like a challenge. Jake felt his grandfather's training kick in. Stay calm, gather information. Don't give away more than necessary. "I think you have me confused with someone else. My grandfather was a mechanic." Was he now? The lean biker stepped forward, his movements carrying the barely contained energy of violence, looking for an excuse. "That what he told you? That he spent 40 years fixing motorcycles and living the quiet life?" Tank raised a hand, and the younger man stopped immediately, a display of authority that spoke volumes about the hierarchy Jake was facing. "Easy, Viper. The kid's just learning about his family history. Ain't that right, Jake? Starting to discover that Grandpa Bobby had some interesting hobbies before he settled down?" Jake's mind raced through possibilities and responses. Each option weighed against his grandfather's teachings about dealing with dangerous men. These weren't random thugs. They were organized, professional, and had been hunting Bobby's secrets for decades, which meant they were also desperate, and desperate men made unpredictable choices. "Look," Jake said, maintaining the tone of a confused college student, "I inherited an old motorcycle that barely runs. If there's some kind of misunderstanding about something my grandfather was involved in 30 years ago, maybe we can—" 37 years ago, Tank corrected with surgical precision. "And there's no misunderstanding, kid. Your grandfather took something that belonged to our employer, something very valuable that we've been looking for ever since. Now that the old man's dead, that debt transfers to you." The third biker, who'd remained silent until now, spoke up with a voice that carried the rough edge of too many cigarettes and not enough conscience. "Question is, Jake, are you going to make this easy on yourself? Or do we need to explain the situation in terms you'll remember better?" Jake's training told him that the moment for talking was ending rapidly. These men had found him, cornered him, and were now moving into the intimidation phase that would escalate to violence if he didn't give them what they wanted. The problem was, he genuinely didn't know how to access whatever his grandfather had hidden, and even if he did, turning it over to these men would dishonor everything Bobby Martinez had died to protect. "Before we go any further," Jake said carefully, "maybe you could tell me exactly what you think my grandfather took, and who you're working for. Because I'm starting to think this conversation is going to end badly for someone." Tank's smile was pure predator. "Oh, it's definitely going to end badly for someone, kid. The only question is whether that someone is you or whether you're smart enough to cooperate and live to see tomorrow." As the three men began moving closer, Jake realized that his grandfather's 37-year game of hide-and-seek was about to become a very different kind of contest. The desert serpents had found their prey, but they were about to discover that Bobby Martinez had taught his grandson more than just how to fix motorcycles. Tank Rodriguez had been in the intimidation business for over 20 years, and he knew exactly how to read people. The kid standing in front of him should have been trembling by now. Most college students would be begging for mercy or offering to call their parents. But Jake Martinez stood with a stillness that Tank found both irritating and intriguing. There was something in the young man's posture that reminded Tank of soldiers he'd known, a quality of alertness that suggested Bobby's grandson might be more than he appeared. "You know what I think, Jake?" Tank said, circling slowly like a shark, testing the waters. "I think your grandfather told you more than you're letting on. See, Bobby Martinez wasn't just some mechanic who got lucky and stumbled into something big. He was Special Forces, 82nd Airborne, the kind of soldier who could disappear into enemy territory for weeks and come back with intelligence that saved lives." Tank's voice carried the grudging respect of one professional acknowledging another's skills. Problem was, Bobby got greedy, had a chance to hand over what he found and walk away clean, but instead, he decided to play hero. Cost some good men their lives when everything went sideways. Viper, the lean biker with prison tattoos, couldn't contain his impatience. "Enough history lessons, Tank. Kid's playing dumb, but he knows something. Look at how he's standing. That ain't some scared college boy. That's someone who's been taught to handle pressure." Jake noted how Viper's eyes never stopped moving, cataloging threats and opportunities with the paranoid efficiency of someone who'd survived years behind bars. His tattoos told stories of violence, teardrops for kills, spiderwebs for time, served and gang affiliations that marked him as someone who'd earned his reputation through blood. The third man, who Tank had called Crusher, represented a different kind of danger entirely. Where Viper was wiry and quick, Crusher was built like a human bulldozer, with hands scarred from years of enforcing payments and extracting information. But it was his eyes that revealed the true threat. Cold, empty, and completely without conscience. Jake had seen that look in his grandfather's nightmares, the expression of men who could hurt people without losing sleep. Crusher here has a gift for making people remember things they thought they'd forgotten. Tank continued, his tone conversational but loaded with menace. "Amazing how pain can jar loose buried memories. Your grandfather might have taught you to stay calm under pressure, but I'm betting he never taught you to handle what Crusher specializes in." Tank pulled out his phone and showed Jake a photograph that made his blood run cold. It was Dr. Vasquez leaving her clinic, taken with telephoto precision that captured every detail of her worried expression. "Pretty lady, your grandfather's doctor, lives alone, walks to work every morning at exactly 7:30. Be a shame if something happened to her because you decided to be uncooperative." The threat to Dr. Vasquez revealed everything Jake needed to know about the kind of men he was facing. These weren't honorable soldiers or even professional criminals with codes of conduct. They were predators who would hurt innocent people to achieve their goals, the kind of evil his grandfather had spent 37 years trying to keep at bay. "See, here's what you need to understand about our employer," Tank said, pocketing the phone with casual menace. "He's been very patient for a very long time. 37 years of patience, waiting for the right moment to collect what Bobby stole. But patience has limits, and those limits expired the day your grandfather died." Viper stepped closer, his movements carrying the coiled tension of a snake preparing to strike. "Our boss knows things about that night in 1987 that would make your blood curdle, kid. Knows about the team Bobby was running with, knows about the cartel money that went missing, knows about the documentation that certain government officials would pay anything to see disappear permanently." "Government officials?" Jake asked, genuinely confused. His grandfather's letter had mentioned corruption, but the scope these men were describing went far beyond what he'd imagined. Tank smiled with genuine amusement. "Oh, that's rich. Bobby really didn't tell you the whole story, did he? Kid, your grandfather didn't just steal from some two-bit drug runners. He took evidence that implicated senators, federal judges, and cartel leaders in a conspiracy that funneled millions of dollars through shell companies and offshore accounts. Crusher spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the rough authority of someone accustomed to having his words taken seriously. Money laundering, arms trafficking, assassination contracts. Your grandfather had documentation for all of it. Names, dates, bank account numbers, photographs of meetings that never officially happened. The magnitude of what his grandfather had hidden was becoming clear, and Jake felt the weight of 37 years of secrets settling on his shoulders. Bobby Martinez hadn't just been protecting his family. He'd been sitting on evidence that could topple governments and destroy criminal empires. So here's how this is going to work, Tank said, his patience finally wearing thin. You're going to take us to that bike. You're going to open whatever compartment Bobby built into it, and you're going to hand over everything he hid. In exchange, you get to live, the doctor gets to keep breathing, and we all walk away from this like civilized people. Jake's mind raced through the implications of Tank's offer. Even if he wanted to cooperate, Dr. Vasquez had said opening the compartment required specific techniques his grandfather had tried to teach him. More importantly, handing over the evidence would mean betraying everything Bobby Martinez had died to protect. And if I refuse? Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. Viper's smile was pure malice. Then we start with the doctor, move on to anyone else you care about, and eventually get around to you. Difference is, by the time we're done, you'll be begging to tell us everything Bobby ever taught you about hiding secrets. Tank checked his watch with the casual efficiency of a man operating on a timeline. You've got until sunset to make your decision, kid. After that, Crusher starts earning his nickname, and this whole situation gets very unpleasant for everyone involved. As the three men prepared to escort Jake to his grandfather's motorcycle, none of them realized they were about to discover that Bobby Martinez had taught his grandson far more than just mechanical skills. The lessons disguised as childhood games were about to be tested in the most dangerous classroom imaginable. The convoy that arrived at Veterans Auto Repair looked like something from a crime movie. Two rumbling Harleys flanking Jake's modest Honda Civic, with Tank's black Escalade bringing up the rear. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty lot, and Jake noticed with practiced awareness that the repair shop's owner was nowhere to be seen. Either the Desert Serpents had planned this timing perfectly, or they'd made sure the location would be private. Jake stepped out of his car with the careful composure his grandfather had drilled into him, keeping his movements calm and non-threatening while his mind cataloged every tactical detail. The shop's layout, the available tools that could serve as weapons, the sightlines to neighboring businesses, all information that might prove crucial in the next few minutes. Nice place, Tank observed, surveying the cluttered garage with the eye of someone who'd conducted business in similar locations. Bet your grandfather spent a lot of time here, working on bikes, telling stories about the old days. Question is, what stories did he tell you? Jake led them toward the corner where his grandfather's Sportster sat beneath a dusty tarp, looking every bit the worthless relic that everyone assumed it to be. As he pulled away the covering, he watched Tank's expression change from casual interest to sharp focus. The Desert Serpent's vice president was clearly seeing something that Jake had missed. Son of a bitch, Viper breathed, running his fingers along the bike's frame with surprising reverence. It's really her. The ghost. Bike we've been chasing for 37 years. Jake's eyebrows rose slightly. Ghost bike? Tank nodded, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing legendary history. Your grandfather's Sportster became something of a myth in certain circles. The bike that disappeared after the Tucson job, carrying secrets that powerful men would kill to recover. Some people thought Bobby had destroyed it. Others figured it was hidden in some bunker in the desert. Nobody imagined he'd been keeping it in plain sight all these years. Crusher circled the motorcycle like a predator examining prey, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he inspected various components. Look at this customization work. Bobby wasn't just hiding things, he was engineering them to stay hidden. This rear compartment modification is military-grade concealment. Jake felt a surge of pride in his grandfather's craftsmanship, even under these circumstances. Every detail of the bike's construction showed the methodical precision of a man who understood that lives depended on his work remaining undiscovered. "So here's how this goes," Tank said, his tone becoming businesslike. "You're going to show us how to access whatever Bobby hid in this bike. We're going to verify that everything's there, and then we're all going to walk away from this like reasonable people." Jake studied the three men carefully, noting how their body language had changed now that they were close to their goal. Viper was practically vibrating with anticipation, his prison-hardened instincts telling him that violence might soon be necessary. Crusher maintained his cold professionalism, but Jake could see the predator's patience wearing thin. Tank remained in control, but there was an edge to his authority that suggested he was operating under pressure from his mysterious employer. "I appreciate the reasonable approach," Jake said carefully, "but there's a problem. My grandfather never actually told me how to open any hidden compartments. I've been trying to figure it out myself for weeks." The silence that followed his statement was loaded with danger. Tank's eyes narrowed as he processed this information, clearly trying to determine whether Jake was lying or simply hadn't yet discovered his grandfather's secrets. "Bullshit," Viper snarled, stepping closer with the aggressive posture of someone ready to escalate to violence. Bobby wouldn't leave his grandson hanging without instructions. Old bastard was too careful for that. Jake maintained his calm exterior while his grandfather's training kicked into high gear. These men were reaching a decision point where talking would end and physical persuasion would begin. "Look, I know how this sounds, but my grandfather had Alzheimer's. By the end, he barely remembered my name, let alone complex instructions about hidden compartments." "Maybe," Tank said slowly, "but Bobby Martinez was also the most paranoid son of a bitch I ever knew. No way he left things to chance. So either you're lying to us, or you haven't looked hard enough." Crusher spoke up with the voice of experience. "Could be the kids telling the truth, Tank. Alzheimer's is a bitch. Scrambles everything up in there. But Bobby was smart. Smart enough to build fail-safes into his plans." Tank's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with the kind of focus that suggested important communication from higher up the food chain. His expression darkened as he read the message, and Jake sensed the timeline accelerating in a dangerous direction. "Change of plans," Tank announced with grim authority. "Our employer's patience just ran out. He wants results tonight, not promises and explanations, which means we're going to figure out how to open that compartment right here, right now, with or without your cooperation." Viper cracked his knuckles with anticipation. "About damn time. I was getting tired of playing nice with college boy here." Jake felt the familiar calm that had always settled over him in crisis situations. His grandfather's greatest gift, the ability to think clearly when everything was falling apart. Bobby Martinez had spent years preparing him for this moment, and now Jake was about to discover exactly what those childhood lessons had been designed to teach him. "Before we do anything irreversible," Jake said with quiet authority that surprised all three bikers, "maybe you should consider that my grandfather didn't just hide evidence in that bike. He booby-trapped it, and the wrong approach won't just destroy what you're looking for. It'll destroy anyone standing too close when it goes wrong." The lie came so smoothly that Jake almost believed it himself, but it bought him the most valuable commodity in any crisis: time to think, time to plan, and time to remember everything his grandfather had taught him about surviving when the odds were stacked against you. Jake's mention of booby traps had the desired effect. All three bikers took an involuntary step back from the Sportster, their bravado momentarily replaced by the healthy respect that experienced criminals developed for explosive devices. Tank's eyes narrowed as he studied Jake's face, trying to determine whether the college student was bluffing or sharing genuine intelligence. "You're telling me Bobby rigged his own bike to explode?" Tank asked, his voice carrying a mixture of skepticism and grudging respect. "That would be just like the paranoid bastard." "But here's what I'm thinking, kid. If there really was a bomb in that bike, you wouldn't be standing this close to it." Jake forced himself to maintain eye contact while his mind raced through possibilities. The lie had bought him time, but these men weren't amateurs. They'd been hunting his grandfather's secrets for decades, which meant they knew Bobby Martinez's methods better than Jake did. "Maybe," Jake said with calculated uncertainty. "Or maybe my grandfather taught me how to disarm." It's hard to say what he might have planned for this exact situation. Viper's patience finally snapped. "Enough of this psychological bullshit. Kid's playing games, Tank. Let me have 5 minutes alone with him and he'll tell us everything from his grandfather's bank account numbers to his favorite bedtime stories." The lean biker stepped forward aggressively, his movements carrying the predatory confidence of someone who'd made a career out of inflicting pain. But instead of backing away, Jake did something that surprised everyone present. He stepped forward to meet Viper's approach, his body language shifting from defensive to something that looked almost welcoming. "You know what?" Jake said with a calmness that seemed to echo from some deep well of confidence. "Maybe that's exactly what we need to do. Get everything out in the open. See what everyone's really made of." Tank raised an eyebrow at Jake's sudden change in demeanor. "Careful what you wish for, college boy. Viper's got 20 years of experience making people regret their smart mouths." Jake's response came with the quiet authority his grandfather had modeled during every crisis they'd ever faced together. 20 years of intimidating people who were afraid of him. Question is, what happens when he runs into someone who isn't? The words hung in the desert air like a challenge that couldn't be ignored. Viper's face flushed with the rage of someone whose reputation was being questioned by a kid who should have been begging for mercy. Crusher shifted his weight slightly, reading the body language of violence about to unfold. "You think you're tough, college boy?" Viper snarled, closing the distance between them until Jake could smell the cigarettes and cheap beer on his breath. "Think your grandfather taught you how to handle real men?" Jake studied Viper's approach with the analytical calm Bobby Martinez had spent years developing in him. The biker was leading with his ego instead of his brain, telegraphing his intentions, with the obvious aggression of someone who'd never faced serious resistance. Prison fighting was different from military combat, and Viper's movement suggested he was used to opponents who were already intimidated before the violence began. "I think," Jake said quietly, "that my grandfather taught me to recognize the difference between dangerous men and bullies who pretend to be dangerous men." The insult hit its target with surgical precision. Viper's face contorted with rage as he reached for Jake's shirt, intending to demonstrate exactly why people feared him. But Jake's response wasn't what anyone expected. Instead of pulling away or preparing to defend himself, he stepped into Viper's space with fluid precision, using the biker's forward momentum against him. The movement was so subtle that Tank and Crusher almost missed it. But suddenly, Viper found himself off balance. His grab turned into an awkward stumble that left him looking foolish rather than threatening. Jake had simply shifted his weight and angled his body in a way that redirected Viper's aggression into empty air. "What the hell?" Viper started to say, but Jake was already moving again, demonstrating the kind of spatial awareness that came from years of training disguised as childhood games. "Problem with bullies," Jake said conversationally, as if he wasn't facing 3 dangerous criminals in an isolated garage, "is that they're used to people being afraid of them. Take away the fear, and they don't really know what to do next." Tank watched this interaction with growing interest. Jake Martinez wasn't responding like a victim. He was responding like someone who'd been trained to handle pressure situations. The college student's body language, his voice control, even the way he positioned himself relative to potential threats, all suggested military or law enforcement training. "Interesting," Tank murmured. his respect for Bobby Martinez's planning growing by the minute. Very interesting. Looks like the old man taught you more than just motorcycle maintenance. Crusher stepped forward, his massive frame blocking Jake's view of the exit as he prepared to end the psychological sparring with physical reality. Enough games. Kid wants to see what real violence looks like. I'm happy to provide a demonstration. But Jake's response surprised them again. Instead of backing down or preparing for a fight, he smiled with genuine amusement. You know what the funny thing is? You guys have been chasing my grandfather's secrets for 37 years, and you still don't understand the most important thing he taught me. Yeah? Tank asked, genuinely curious despite himself. What's that? Jake's smile widened as he prepared to reveal the first hint of what Bobby Martinez had really been preparing him for. Sometimes the best way to win a fight is to make sure it happens exactly where and when you want it to. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed across the empty lot. Multiple engines, coordinated timing, and the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. Tank's face went pale as he realized that Jake Martinez had been leading them into something far more sophisticated than a simple shakedown. The grandson of Bobby Martinez was about to show the desert serpents that some lessons were worth waiting 37 years to teach. The approaching vehicles turned out to be a maintenance crew from the city's water department. Their timing unfortunate, but their presence enough to remind the desert serpents that they were operating in broad daylight with potential witnesses nearby. Tank's expression darkened as he realized Jake had deliberately chosen a location where law enforcement could arrive quickly if things went wrong. Clever, Tank admitted with grudging respect, watching the city workers park near the street. But you're forgetting something important, college boy. We've been playing this game a lot longer than you have, and we know how to adapt when situations change. Jake maintained his calm exterior while calculating new variables. The workers were staying near their trucks, focused on a water main issue. That would keep them busy for at least 30 minutes. Not law enforcement, but still witnesses who might complicate whatever the desert serpents were planning. Here's what's going to happen, Tank continued, his voice taking on the cold efficiency of someone making tactical adjustments. We're going to move this party somewhere more private, somewhere you and I can have a proper conversation about your grandfather's legacy without worrying about interruptions. Viper stepped closer to Jake, his earlier embarrassment transforming into focused malice. Kid made me look stupid in front of my brothers. That's going to cost him extra when we get where we're going. But it was Crusher who provided the most chilling details of their new plan. Got a warehouse on the east side. Soundproof, private, fully equipped for extended conversations. Place where we can take all the time we need to help you remember things your grandfather might have mentioned. Jake felt his grandfather's training assess the new threat parameters. Being moved to a secondary location was always a worst-case scenario. It eliminated escape routes, removed potential help, and gave the aggressors complete control over the environment. Bobby Martinez had been clear about one thing. Never let yourself be taken somewhere isolated if you could possibly avoid it. Or, Jake said with calculated calm, we could save everyone some time and I could just tell you what I know right here. Tank's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Funny how your memory suddenly improved. What changed your mind about cooperating? Jake gestured toward the water department workers. Witnesses have a way of clarifying your priorities. Look, maybe I've been playing this wrong from the beginning. Maybe we can work something out that benefits everyone. The apparent capitulation was exactly what Tank had been hoping for, but his years of experience told him to be suspicious of easy victories. Go on, I'm listening. My grandfather didn't just hide documents in that bike, Jake said, his voice carrying the weight of someone revealing carefully guarded secrets. He hid money, a lot of money, cash from that 1987 job that nobody ever found because they were too busy looking for papers and photographs. Viper's eyes lit up with greed. How much money? Enough to make you forget about whatever your employer is paying you for this job, Jake replied smoothly. Enough to make all three of you independently wealthy if you're willing to cut me in as a partner instead of treating me like a victim. Tank studied Jake's face with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades distinguishing truth from deception. Interesting proposition. But here's the problem. Our employer doesn't just want money. He wants those documents, and he wants them badly enough to pay us very well for exclusive delivery. Documents can be copied, Jake pointed out. Digital photos, scanned files. Give your employer what he needs to know his secrets are safe, but keep the originals as insurance. Smart man like you must have considered that possibility. The suggestion hit its target perfectly. Tank was indeed smart enough to have considered double-crossing his employer if the reward was sufficient, and Jake's offer played directly into that calculating mindset. Crusher, however, remained focused on practical concerns. Kid's talking a good game, but we still don't know if he can actually access whatever Bobby hid. Could be bullshitting us about the money same way he tried to bullshit us about booby traps. Fair point, Tank acknowledged. Which brings us back to our original plan. Jake here is going to demonstrate his access to Grandpa's secrets, and we're going to verify that everything he's promising actually exists. Jake nodded, as if accepting the inevitable, while his mind raced through his grandfather's teachings about surviving impossible situations. Bobby Martinez had been captured twice during his military service, and both times he'd escaped by making his captors believe they were in control while he systematically gathered intelligence and waited for the right moment to act. Tell you. What? Jake said, pulling out his phone with steady hands. Let me call the storage facility and have them bring some proper tools. No point in damaging the bike or its contents with improvised equipment. Tank's suspicion flared immediately. Nice try. No phone calls, no delays, no opportunities for you to signal for help. We work with what's available right here, right now. Viper cracked his knuckles with anticipation. Besides, if college boy here is half as smart as his grandfather, he'll figure out how to open that compartment without fancy tools. Motivation's a wonderful thing. Jake felt the noose tightening around his options, but his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. When you can't avoid the trap, spring it on your own terms. Bobby Martinez had taught him that sometimes the best defense was to appear helpless, while positioning yourself for a counterattack that your enemies never saw coming. All right, Jake said with apparent resignation. But if we're doing this here, we need to be smart about it. Those city workers aren't paying attention now, but if they hear power tools or see us crowding around the bike, they might get curious. Tank nodded approvingly. Now you're thinking like a professional. Viper, go chat with our municipal friends over there. Make sure they stay focused on their water main and don't develop any interest in vintage motorcycles. As Viper walked toward the city workers, Jake realized he was about to face the most dangerous part of his grandfather's 37-year plan. The moment when Bobby Martinez's training would either save his life or get him killed trying to protect secrets that powerful men had been hunting since before Jake was born. While Viper distracted the city workers with a fabricated story about vintage motorcycle restoration, Tank moved closer to Jake with the predatory focus of someone preparing to extract information through psychological pressure. The Desert Serpents. Vice President had decades of experience reading people, and he sensed that Jake Martinez was still holding back crucial details. You know what I think, college boy? Tank said, his voice taking on the conversational tone that experienced interrogators used to lower their subjects' defenses. I think you're still playing games with us, still trying to be the smart guy in the room, just like your grandfather. Jake maintained his composure while Tank circled him slowly, the way a shark might test wounded prey before moving in for the kill. I've told you what I know. The bike has hidden compartments, there's money involved, and we can work together instead of against each other. See, that's where you're wrong, Tank continued, his voice hardening with each word. Your grandfather was never the team player you're trying to be. Bobby Martinez was a selfish bastard who put his own survival ahead of his brothers in arms. You want to know what really happened in 1987? The question hung in the desert air like a loaded weapon. Jake found himself genuinely curious about the details of his grandfather's secret mission, even as he recognized Tank's words as psychological manipulation designed to make him doubt everything Bobby had taught him. Your precious grandfather was supposed to recover stolen military equipment and turn it over to his commanding officers, Tank said with the authority of someone who'd been briefed on classified details. Instead, he decided to freelance, kept the best stuff for himself, sold some of it to the highest bidders, and buried the evidence so deep that even his own team couldn't find it. Jake felt a flash of anger at the accusation, but his grandfather's training kicked in automatically. Bobby Martinez had taught him that enemies would always try to poison your mind against the people you loved, and that anger was a luxury you couldn't afford when your life was on the line. Funny thing about your grandfather's heroic military service, Crusher added, his massive frame casting a shadow over Jake as he joined Tank's psychological assault. 3 purple hearts, bronze star with V device, all those pretty ribbons. You know how he really earned them? Jake remained silent, recognizing the interrogation technique of offering information to create doubt and extract responses. His grandfather had warned him about this exact scenario during those camping trips that had really been survival training sessions. Bobby Martinez earned those medals by surviving missions where his teammates died. Tank continued with surgical precision. Funny how the old bastard always managed to be the sole survivor, always the one who made it back to tell the story. Makes you wonder if he was just lucky, or if he was making deals to save his own skin. The attack on his grandfather's military honor was designed to provoke an emotional response, and Jake felt the familiar calm that Bobby had taught him to find in crisis situations. Every word Tank spoke revealed more about the Desert Serpent's intelligence sources than about his grandfather's actual service record. You're starting to see it, aren't you? Viper said, returning from his conversation with the city workers with a satisfied expression. Starting to wonder if the man who raised you was really the hero you thought he was, or just another mercenary who got lucky and lived long enough to tell lies about his own courage. Jake studied the 3 men with the analytical mind his grandfather had spent years developing. Their psychological assault was coordinated and professional, suggesting they'd used these techniques successfully before. But something about their approach felt desperate, as if they needed Jake to doubt his grandfather's legacy before they could break his resistance to their demands. Here's what I find interesting, Jake said with quiet authority that surprised all 3 bikers. You're spending a lot of energy trying to convince me that my grandfather was a criminal and a coward. Question is, why does that matter so much to you? Tank's expression flickered with annoyance at Jake's refusal to take the bait. Maybe because we want you to understand the kind of man you're protecting. Maybe because we think you deserve to know the truth about Bobby Martinez before you decide to follow in his footsteps. Or maybe, Jake continued with growing confidence, because you know that everything he taught me about honor and integrity is exactly what's going to stop me from giving you what you want. Crusher stepped forward with obvious irritation. Kids, got a smart mouth on him. Maybe it's time to move past the psychology lessons and start on the practical education. But Jake wasn't finished. His grandfather's training had included lessons about turning interrogation techniques back on the interrogators, and he could see that his questions were having an effect on the Desert Serpent's coordination. You know what I think? Jake said, his voice carrying the same calm authority Bobby Martinez had used during every crisis they'd faced together. I think you're terrified that I might actually be everything my grandfather trained me to be. Because if that's true, then you're not dealing with some scared college kid who'll break under pressure. Tank's face darkened with the realization that Jake Martinez wasn't responding like a victim. Yeah? Then what are we dealing with, smart guy? Jake's smile carried 37 years of careful preparation and a lifetime of Bobby Martinez's tactical wisdom. You're dealing with someone who's been trained since childhood to handle exactly this situation. Someone who knows that the best way to survive dangerous men is to be more dangerous than they are. The silence that followed Jake's words was loaded with a new kind of tension, The desert serpents were beginning to realize that Bobby Martinez's grandson might be far more prepared for this confrontation than any of them had anticipated. Viper broke the silence with nervous laughter. Big words from someone who's outnumbered 3-1 with nowhere to run. Jake's response came with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been waiting his entire life for this moment. "Who says I'm planning to run?" Tank Rodriguez had been in the intimidation business long enough to recognize when psychological warfare wasn't working, and Jake Martinez's calm defiance was beginning to unnerve him. Time to escalate to the kind of personal attacks that broke even the strongest spirits, targeting the core values that defined a person's identity. "You want to know what your grandfather really thought about family loyalty?" Tank said, pulling out his phone and scrolling to a photograph that made Jake's blood freeze. It was a picture of him and Bobby taken just 6 months before the old man's death, sitting together in the garage working on a neighbor's motorcycle. Someone had been watching them for a very long time. "We've been monitoring the Martinez family for over a year," Tank continued with cold satisfaction. "Ever since Bobby's Alzheimer's diagnosis hit the medical records. Amazing what you can learn about someone when you have access to their doctors, their pharmacy records, their daily routines." Jake felt his grandfather's calm beginning to crack as Tank revealed the extent of their surveillance. The idea that these predators had been watching Bobby's final months, waiting like vultures for him to die, filled Jake with a rage that threatened to overwhelm his tactical training. "Your grandfather knew we were watching," Viper added with malicious pleasure. Doc Vasquez mentioned some interesting conversations she had with Bobby toward the end. "Old bastard was terrified that we'd come after you before you were ready to handle us." The mention of Dr. Vasquez sent a chill down Jake's spine. These men had been thorough in their intelligence gathering, which meant they knew about every person Jake cared about, every potential pressure point they could exploit. "Here's what Bobby Martinez really thought about family values," Tank said, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a death sentence. "He thought you were weak, thought you'd never be tough enough to handle the truth about his past. That's why he spent 37 years running from his responsibilities instead of teaching you to be a real man." Jake's hands clenched involuntarily, as Tank's words struck at everything he believed about his relationship with his grandfather. Bobby Martinez had been the most important person in his life, the steady presence who'd guided him through childhood trauma and taught him everything he knew about honor and integrity. "You think those camping trips were about bonding?" Crusher laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humanity. "Those were practice sessions for abandoning you when things got too dangerous. Bobby was teaching you to survive alone because he knew someday he'd have to choose between protecting his secrets and protecting his family." The attack on his grandfather's love and devotion was designed to shatter Jake's emotional foundation, but it also revealed something important. These men didn't understand the true nature of Bobby Martinez's training. They saw survival skills and tactical awareness, but they missed the deeper lessons about courage and sacrifice that had been woven into every moment they'd spent together. "Want to know the real joke?" Viper said, stepping closer with predatory satisfaction. "Your grandfather's famous integrity was just cowardice dressed up in pretty words. Every choice he made was about saving his own skin and keeping his comfortable little life intact, even if it meant putting you in danger." Jake felt something shift inside him as Viper's words crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His grandfather's integrity wasn't just a personal value. It was the foundation of everything Jake believed about justice, honor, and the responsibility to protect innocent people from predators like the desert serpents. "You know what the really pathetic part is?" Tank continued, sensing that his psychological assault was finally having an effect. "You're defending a man who never even trusted you with the truth. Bobby Martinez looked at his own grandson and decided you weren't strong enough, smart enough, or loyal enough to be brought into his confidence." The accusation that his grandfather hadn't trusted him struck deeper than Jake expected, touching fears he'd carried since childhood about whether he was worthy of Bobby's love and investment. But it also reminded him of something crucial. His grandfather's final letter had explicitly stated that every lesson, every skill, every moment of training had been preparation for exactly this situation. "You want to prove your grandfather's faith in you was justified?" Crusher asked with mock sympathy. "Then stop pretending to be something you're not. Stop playing the hero in a story where you're just another victim waiting to happen." Jake studied the three men with new clarity, understanding finally what his grandfather had been preparing him to face. These weren't just criminals seeking money or documents. They were the kind of evil that Bobby Martinez had spent his entire life fighting against. The predators who used fear and violence to corrupt everything good in the world. "You're right about one thing," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying a new quality that made all three bikers pause. "My grandfather did teach me exactly what I needed to know to handle this situation." Tank sensed the change in Jake's demeanor and felt the first whisper of unease. "Yeah? And what's that, college boy?" Jake's smile was pure Bobby Martinez, calm, confident, and completely without fear. "He taught me the difference between men who fight for something bigger than themselves and animals who only know how to destroy and consume." The air in the garage seemed to thicken with tension as Jake's words hung between them. Viper's hand moved instinctively toward the knife he carried, while Crusher shifted his weight in preparation for violence. Tank found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about Bobby Martinez's grandson. "Most importantly," Jake continued with growing authority, "he taught me that when you're facing true evil, compromise isn't an option. You either stand up for what's right, or you become part of what's wrong." Tank realized with dawning unease that their psychological assault had achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of breaking Jake Martinez, they had awakened something in him, that his grandfather had spent 37 years preparing for this exact moment. Tank Rodriguez felt the psychological momentum slipping away from him as Jake Martinez stood with increasing confidence in the center of the garage. The college student who should have been begging for mercy was instead radiating the kind of calm authority that Tank had only seen in the most dangerous men he'd ever encountered. Time for the nuclear option, an attack so personal and brutal that it would shatter whatever confidence Bobby Martinez had built in his grandson. "You know what, kid?" Tank said, pulling out a manila folder that had been tucked inside his leather jacket. "Maybe it's time you learned the whole truth about your precious grandfather's heroic legacy." Jake watched Tank's movements with the heightened awareness his grandfather had trained into him, noting how the Desert Serpent's leader handled the folder with the reverence of someone carrying explosive material. Whatever was inside those documents represented something Tank considered his ultimate weapon. "These are copies of classified military reports from 1987, Tank announced, his voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a death sentence. "Filed by the survivors of Operation Nightfall, the mission your grandfather led into cartel territory." "Want to know what his own team said about Bobby Martinez's command decisions?" Jake remained silent, but his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "When someone offers you information designed to hurt you, ask yourself why they need you to believe it so badly." Tank opened the folder and began reading with theatrical precision. Private First Class Michael Chen, age 19, killed when Sergeant Martinez ordered the team to advance through an unsecured corridor. Staff Sergeant David Thompson, age 24, died covering Martinez's retreat when the operation went sideways. Corporal James Wilson, age 21, executed by cartel enforcers after being left behind during the extraction. Each name hit Jake like a physical blow. These weren't just statistics or propaganda. They were real men who had died under his grandfather's command, young soldiers whose families had grieved their loss for over 3 decades. "Your grandfather never told you about his boys, did he?" Viper said with sadistic satisfaction. "Never mentioned the 3 graves he's responsible for, the 3 families who never got their sons back because Bobby Martinez was too busy playing treasure hunter to do his job." Jake felt something crack inside his chest as the weight of his grandfather's hidden guilt settled on his shoulders. Bobby Martinez hadn't just been carrying the burden of stolen documents for 37 years. He'd been living with the knowledge that his decisions had cost 3 young men their lives. "Here's the really beautiful part," Crusher added, his massive hands handling a second folder with surprising gentleness. "We tracked down the families. Chen's parents still live in San Francisco, run a little restaurant in Chinatown. Thompson's widow remarried, but she still visits his grave every week with their daughter, who never got to meet her daddy because of your grandfather's choices." The mention of families devastated by his grandfather's actions struck Jake deeper than any personal attack could have. These weren't just names in a file. They were real people whose lives had been destroyed by decisions Bobby Martinez had made in a moment of crisis. Wilson's mother spent every penny she had hiring private investigators to find out what really happened to her son, Tank continued with surgical precision. Died 5 years ago, still believing that someone, somewhere, knew the truth about why. Her boy never came home. Jake's hands trembled slightly as the magnitude of his grandfather's secret burden became clear. Bobby Martinez hadn't just been protecting government secrets. He'd been hiding from the families of the men who died under his command, carrying guilt that would have destroyed a weaker man. "So here's our offer," Tank said, closing the folders. With finality. "Help us recover what your grandfather stole, and we'll make sure these families finally get the truth about their loved ones. Refuse, and they'll spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened to the sons, husbands, and fathers who died because Bobby Martinez chose treasure over honor." The ultimatum was perfectly crafted to exploit Jake's deepest values. His grandfather had raised him to believe that honor meant protecting innocent people and taking responsibility for your actions. Now Tank was offering him a chance to right his grandfather's greatest wrong, but only by betraying everything Bobby had died to protect. "Think about it, college boy," Viper said with malicious pleasure. "You could be the hero who finally gives these families closure. All you have to do is admit that your grandfather was a coward and a murderer who cared more about money than about the men under his command." Jake felt the sacred boundary of his grandfather's memory under assault from an angle he'd never anticipated. Bobby Martinez hadn't just hidden government corruption. He'd hidden the deaths of 3 soldiers whose families deserved answers, deserved justice, deserved the truth about what had happened to their loved ones. "Those families have been living with unanswered questions for 37 years, Tank pressed, sensing that his psychological warfare was finally achieving its intended effect. Questions that only you can answer now. Questions about why their boys had to die so that Bobby Martinez could play hero with stolen documents. Jake stared at the folders containing the documented evidence of his grandfather's command failures, feeling the weight of 37 years of hidden guilt and 3 families' unresolved grief. The foundation of everything he believed about, Bobby Martinez was cracking under the weight of documented truth. But then Jake remembered something his grandfather had said during one of their last coherent conversations, when Alzheimer's was beginning to steal the old soldier's memories. "Sometimes the hardest thing about being a leader is living with the consequences of decisions you made to save as many people as possible." The words took on new meaning, as Jake realized that Tank's psychological assault was missing the most important piece of the puzzle: why Bobby Martinez had made those fateful command decisions in the first place, and what he'd been trying to prevent by accepting the burden of 3 men's deaths. Tank Rodriguez made his fatal mistake when he pulled out the final photograph. A picture of Bobby Martinez kneeling beside 3 flag-draped coffins at Arlington National Cemetery, his face etched with grief that 37 years hadn't diminished. The image had been taken secretly, without the old soldier's knowledge, capturing his most private moment of mourning. "Look at him," Tank sneered, holding the photograph inches from Jake's face, playing the grieving commander at his boys' funerals. Wonder what he was really thinking about, their sacrifice, or how much money he was going to make from the documents he stole while they were dying. That's when Tank crossed the line that could never be uncrossed. He spat on the photograph, his saliva covering Bobby Martinez's grieving face, and threw it at Jake's feet. Your grandfather was nothing but a grave-robbing piece of— Stop. Jake's voice cut through Tank's insult with the authority of 3 generations of military service. The word wasn't shouted or screamed. It was delivered with the quiet finality of a man who had reached his breaking point and found something unbreakable on the other side. Tank's words died in his throat as he saw something change in Jake Martinez's eyes. The calm college student was gone, replaced by something that Bobby Martinez had spent 37 years preparing for this exact moment. "You want to know the truth about Operation Nightfall?" Jake asked, his voice carrying new weight as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, the same one he'd used to capture his grandfather's stories during the Alzheimer's years. "You want to know why 3 good men died and why my grandfather carried that guilt for the rest of his life?" Tank's confidence wavered as Jake pressed play, and Bobby Martinez's voice filled the garage with crystalline clarity. "The mission wasn't about recovering stolen military equipment, mijo. It was about stopping a conspiracy that went all the way to the Pentagon. Those cartel leaders weren't just smuggling drugs, they were trafficking children. Hundreds of them, sold to the highest bidders while government officials took their cut and looked the other way." The words hit the desert serpents like physical blows, but Bobby's recorded voice continued with the precision of a soldier making his final report. "When we discovered what was really happening, I had a choice: follow orders and let the trafficking continue, or save as many children as possible and accept that my team might not make it out alive. Chen, Thompson, and Wilson, they voted unanimously to save the kids. They died heroes, not victims." Jake watched Tank's face go pale as the true scope of Bobby Martinez's sacrifice became clear. The stolen documents hadn't been about money or personal gain. They contained evidence of a child trafficking network that connected cartel leaders to high-ranking government officials. "The documents I took weren't financial records or arms. Deals. They were purchase orders, Jake. Detailed transactions showing which officials were buying which children, for how much, and where they were being delivered. Evidence that would destroy some of the most powerful people in the world, but more importantly, evidence that could save thousands of innocent lives." Jake reached behind his grandfather's motorcycle and triggered the hidden mechanism that Bobby had taught him during their last coherent conversation. The rear compartment opened with mechanical precision, revealing not money or gold, but dozens of files, photographs, and digital storage devices containing 37 years of accumulated evidence. "This is why my grandfather carried that guilt," Jake said, pulling out photographs that made Viper visibly recoil. "Because he knew that 3 good men died to expose a network of monsters who buy and sell children like livestock. And this is why he trained me my entire life, because he knew that someday someone would have to finish what they started." Tank stared at the evidence in growing horror, realizing that the desert serpents had been working for the very people responsible for the trafficking network Bobby Martinez had died trying to expose. Their mysterious employer wasn't just corrupt. He was one of the architects of systematic child abuse on an international scale. "You want to know what real courage looks like?" Jake asked, his voice carrying his grandfather's quiet authority. "It's 3 soldiers voting to save children they'd never met, knowing it would probably cost them their lives. It's a man carrying the weight of their sacrifice for 37 years while he gathered evidence to finish their mission." Jake stood up with the digital recorder still playing Bobby's final message. "If you're hearing this, mijo, it means they've finally come for what I've been protecting. Remember what I taught you about standing up to bullies, about protecting people who can't protect themselves. The choice is yours now. You can let this evidence disappear and those children continue to suffer, or you can be the man I raised you to be." Tank Rodriguez found himself facing a 23-year-old college student who had just revealed himself to be something far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The inheritor of 37 years of accumulated evidence and a lifetime of training from one of the most effective soldiers the 82nd Airborne had ever produced. "So here's how this ends," Jake said with Bobby Martinez's calm finality. "You're going to walk away from here and never come back. You're going to tell your employer that the evidence disappeared with my grandfather. And you're going to pray that I never decide to use what he left me to finish what 3 heroes started in 1987. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant sound of approaching sirens, real ones this time, summoned by Dr. Vasquez when Jake had triggered the hidden transmitter his grandfather had sewn into his jacket years earlier. Tank Rodriguez, Viper, and Crusher found themselves staring at a young man who had just proved that heroism, like an old Harley-Davidson, could be passed down from one generation to the next, often hidden beneath layers of rust and time, waiting for the right moment to roar back to life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.